All right, welcome, Emily. So excited to have you with me here. For those listening, welcome to the Groundwork show, where we interview the folks building ecosystems at some of the most exciting companies in the world. I'm super excited to have Emily Yuhas with me, who's the founder and CEO of Awtomic, a really cool company. Building in an ecosystem that I think is very relevant to a lot of our listeners, and so excited for her to kind of dig into that. But would love to just start with how you got to where you are today in your journey. If you could kind of give us a background to that, Emily.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here. So I started in, I've been in tech for over a decade. I started my career at Microsoft, working in the Office user experience team. From there, I ended up working on Xbox as well, and then kind of started my first entrepreneurial journey. My first startup, which actually started out of a startup weekend, which is kind of like a fun pitching event. It was a marketplace for editing services for writers. I moved down to the Bay Area, did like an accelerator, kind of lived that, bunk house startup life, and then realized pretty quickly that it would help a lot to have more of a network when building a company. And so I ended up merging with another startup, but then eventually decided I wanted to kind of see what it was like working at different stages of companies and really, building my network, and especially in the startup space, because I knew I wanted to try again someday. So I ended up working at everything from a seed stage company, Series A, moved my way up to kind of mid-size, worked at Redfin, and then most recently at Eventbrite, was there for a couple years. And that's actually where I met my co-founders and many of my current teammates at Atomic. Then during the pandemic, ended up getting into Y Combinator, and then from there starting Atomic based on a problem that I had seen, while working with my sister on her e-commerce site. So she has a brand. She sells products on Shopify, and had really been feeling the pain around wanting to grow her subscription program and more, repeat purchase behavior from customers, and didn't really know where to start. And as I looked into it, I realized lots of people didn't really know where to start. And the reason was that there weren't really very many tools that worked out of the box to really set up great subscriptions. And so that's where Atomic was born. We've been at it for about 3 years now. Yeah, it's been an exciting journey.
Awesome. Yeah, and I can tell you that I've felt this pain as well, where there's some companies that I love buying things from. There's a local guy in Seattle who he operates like a natural wine store, and I've tried to get him to use your product because I'm like, hey, just put me on a subscription. Like, don't make me have to choose the wines every few weeks. It's like a real hassle, and I'd be happy for them to just show up. And he hasn't done it yet, but
Right.
it's a little bit of a luddite. But I'm selling on your behalf.
We'll
Uh,
work on it. I love
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think it's an awesome product, and yeah, and like I'm excited to kind of hear about how you operate in that ecosystem, given it's like it's so active, both on the services side and on the kind of integrations and tools and product side as well. But I thought we could kind of start talking a little bit about Microsoft. Obviously, Microsoft, maybe not obviously, but to many people in the partnerships world, Microsoft is kind of considered one of the best in class companies in the world when it comes to partnering. Office, and I think that they call it the commercial revenue, but like that whole stack of tools, I want to say like 95 plus percent of that revenue comes through partners. It's like a really huge amount of the businesses with partners over there. And like I'm interested looking back now on your time at Microsoft, whether it was in Office or the other teams, like what maybe you didn't necessarily think of as partnerships then, like looking back now that you've kind of touched partnerships in your role as CEO at your current company, were there like partners or other types of companies that you were interacting with in your day to day that yeah, like would I guess be considered partners now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to admit it, but the time I worked at Microsoft was when we were still doing 3-year long release cycles. So
Wow.
very different from the world today, both for me and for them. But yeah, it's interesting, looking back before, I think at least I really knew about partnerships. Um, Microsoft has a really interesting model in comparison to Apple, for example, which, I feel like Apple tries to do a lot of things on their own. Microsoft started, heavily reliant on partners, especially hardware partners, for example. And so, that's a really interesting piece of it. And then, as we built software there, we had to think a lot about how it would work across a bunch of different devices, including Apple devices. In fact, there was a whole team dedicated to Office for Mac, and it was actually a totally different app. Like, it was built around like it was actually a team of like kind of Apple fanatics, which is kind of ironic at Microsoft. But like, they had different usability patterns and things that they were very passionate about, that were kind of core to how people use Apple devices differently from Windows devices. And while I was there, actually, they launched the first version of the Surface, which is also really different from how it looks today. But that was an interesting experiment, and kind of like trying to own more of the end to end. And I think, they have invested more in that, but ultimately, I still think partnerships, when you look at Microsoft's strategy as business, has been, so core, and a big part of their ability to scale and have success and work, across, be just a really great platform. For example, I tried to get my mom to use a Mac at one point, and she's a big Quicken user. And there's just a lot of things that I think are built out more thoroughly and easier to use and more sophisticated on Windows machines, because of that early focus on partners, and being more of an open kind of platform versus others. So yeah, I think that's been really interesting to see. I think they have an interesting balance. They've experimented with different things over time, but that's been like a core part of their business from the beginning.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I haven't really thought about that in the, but like the for people that use PCs, it is incredibly sticky for them. Like the switching for them is really difficult, and it has a lot to do with the apps, or like the products installed on the PC rather than the PC itself. I think people can figure out the difference in the buttons and the UI pretty quickly, but it's like, oh, Excel doesn't do this, on a Mac, or and it's got a lot to do with the other products and integrations. Most of those started out as apps that Microsoft wasn't building themselves. It was third-party developers building. I had never really thought about that. That's like quite a cool insight for like how people are still using some of these machines. No judgments, obviously. And so like I have to ask, you worked in the Office team, obviously, like like Microsoft's investment in open AI, and like specifically like chat GPT use cases is really interesting. I think, it's probably one of the most interesting partner plays that they've done in recent history, at least, or like anyone's done in recent history potentially, and one of the most savvy. And I'm just interested to hear your perspective on that, and like also maybe even given your time at Microsoft, like the potential impact of AI on gaming as well, because I think that that's like an area that we're going to see a lot of development there. And like, yeah, is it like something that you really see Microsoft potentially being able to integrate into their business? And yeah, I'd love to hear your kind of POV on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I left right around the time that Satya took over, and I think the DNA of the company changed really significantly when that happened. Like, while I was there, and one of the reasons I left was that it felt very kind of stodgy, and like, um, it, it's kind of unfair in that, like, a lot of the bets, we were working on like storing documents in the cloud, and a lot of the bets that we were making did end up really being the right thing and paying off. But I think that they've been much more kind of like on top of things and experimental. And Satya came from the Azure org, and that was kind of one of the places that mindset started, and in the company. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool opportunity for them as they integrate OpenAI. And I think it's cool that they didn't just. I mean, I'm sure like they have their own investments and research, But I think, partnering there will be a way for them to be stronger faster, which I think is such a core part of partnerships. And that is something that maybe they wouldn't have done in the past, but it's cool that they're open to it now. And I think you're right that it's a major strategic advantage and play that they're making. I think it'll be really cool to see what happens in gaming as well. I mean, I think, there's like the idea, I think people already love, kind of the choose your own adventure, like smart feeling of games. And like the more you can kind of lean into that creativity and of like not being able to expect what happens next, I think that will make things really interesting and different and kind of take things to a new level. So I'm excited to see what happens there. And I'm glad that they really jumped on it. I mean, I think everyone's kind of felt the pressure, like, how do I incorporate AI? This is going to change the world. And I think in the past, like it could have been something that, Microsoft pulled something out of Microsoft research that was like not quite right and like tried to shove it out, and they didn't do that, this time. So I think to their credit, their strategy around it is great.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people say about Microsoft being kind of best in class from a partnerships perspective is certainly that there's a culture of partnering from the top down, and that originates with Satya Nadella. It seems like he's out there advocating for partners in public, and like building these types of partnerships and relationships, or at least supporting them from top down, and it's really impressive to see all of the progress that they've kind of made in that space. And so I think like when I think about your background, you've been like really well prepared for working with partners now. And so you worked at one of the best partnering companies in the world. Even back then, Microsoft was doing an amazing job. And then you built a marketplace for service providers, and that's like really the other side of the coin from a tech partnerships perspective. And so like I'd love to hear a little bit about that, like, but maybe with the framing of what you do today and like the type of partners that you're working with, and like just that whole, if you could just give us an introduction to your interactions with partners in Awtomic as it exists today, and then we can kind of talk about the service providers marketplace as well, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So, gosh, especially lately, partners and partnerships has been like one of the most important things to me as a CEO. Like, I think, coming into e-commerce, which was somewhat new to me when I started Atomic, I saw it as like an interesting growth channel, but like one of many potentially. And it's started to become more and more obvious. And I don't know if this is like times are actively changing, or, it's something that I just didn't put enough emphasis on in the beginning, but that it's like such a critical part of our growth story. And I think, more effective in a lot of ways than other things that, people can invest in. So I think, in our world, partnerships, there are a bunch of different types of partnerships. There are um, agency partnerships. So a lot of the brands we work with also work with agencies to set up their websites. A lot of the agencies make recommendations around what apps they should use. And so they have a lot of influence over that decision. They like to recommend ones that they're familiar with, or that they know can, really make, them look good as well as they set up the sites. And so that's really important. It's an important relationship to grow with them. And then another major category is app partnerships. So we have, especially in the Shopify ecosystem, a lot of different apps. Each app kind of has its area of focus. And, what I found more and more is that, it's really powerful for apps to work well together in terms of, the experience for the merchant. And that can be a major way that, people hear about us and that we can grow, is when, everyone at the end of the day, it's all about, it's all about revenue. And so if our app working with another app can ultimately win them more deals, they're going to tell people strongly to pick our app. And so, I think that it's become like the referral network through partners is just incredibly powerful. And And then beyond that, just like functionally what we can deliver when we don't focus on trying to like build everything and be good at everything, but really just have great partners. Whether it's that they're an agency and they're delivering on a really great website, or another app that, for example, does like really detailed churn mitigation. It makes our functionality more powerful to have them as a partner and vice versa. And so I think there's just so much mutual benefit, but at the end of the day, again, like it's just an incredibly powerful growth channel. Like I think, kind of on the churn mitigation topic, I was talking to a churn mitigation app about a partnership the other day, and I asked them about their go to market, and they were basically like, "Oh yeah, well we work with subscription apps, and they refer us, and that's how we've grown." And they work with some really great brands; they're quite large, but it was basically 100% through partnerships because they solved a problem for partners as like almost a starting point of their business. So I mean, you can even go that extreme where you almost like, I'm not saying that they did this necessarily, but come up with a business idea that is just a really strong partnership angle, and that can be a great strategy to start with. So
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting, like the spectrum of like, oh, we're a business that's literally based on partner referrals. That's like 100% the way we grow, and that's the only thing we're going to invest in, to it being one of a few different channels, but I think always an important one, in the sense that there's nothing really quite as strong as a referral. And when you compare that to like cold outbound email or some other way of getting in touch with someone, I think that's where partnerships are really amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, that's amazing background. And I would love to hear a little bit about like your expectations of partnerships for the business. Like, do you have KPIs around partnerships internally at the moment? And like, what do you hope to see and expect to see from the different partners that you're working with at the moment?
Yeah, to be totally honest, it's something we're like just starting to lean into. And I think that, part of it was because I had a really shallow understanding of it going into it. Like I was thinking, oh, we'll meet some partners, we'll throw each other's logo up on our websites, we'll do maybe a blog post together, and that'll kind of be, most of the partnership. And then hopefully they'll remember us and say something. But the way I've been thinking about it has changed a lot lately, and in terms of really leaning into partners, I guess being more specific about who our partners are and how we can have like clear connection and value, and that just being infinitely more valuable than a logo on some partner page. Like I think like the churn mitigation example, we may never go that deep, but we will have an answer in this partner for any customer who asks. And that's really powerful. And there's a lot of mutual value there. And so we both have a lot to gain from that partnership, which I think, is a sign of like a partnership that will not just pay off in the initial like blog post moment, but like for a long, long time. And so the way I've been thinking about it has changed a lot. And that kind of goes even for agencies. Like, I think agencies might, and this is more like web development or marketing agencies, like they may be interested in kind of meeting you initially, but where the relationship gets really valuable is when you have a mutual customer, or if we can prove that working with us ultimately means either they can offer an additional service, or deliver on their customers' needs in a more effective way. And so I think lately it's been less about the, oh, let's just go get a bunch of partners so we can throw them up and like appear to have social proof, and more about let's have meaningful connections where it's like a long term, not only again like the referral aspect, but long term like beneficial to both of our businesses actually. And I think that's where we'll be investing more going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's actually awesome. You were saying that you're kind of early in this journey, but it's awesome that you've gone along so far along the journey yourself, because like you seem to like really understand what it means at this point to have like a true partnership. And like I think most people that are in a partnerships role, they run into challenges with the executive leadership team where like quite off. There's kind of two tracks. There's the track that you mentioned where it's like someone like yourself, where you've basically identified, hey, this is something really interesting for our business, and and we should like invest here, and it's important. Or like the kind of retention focused company that you mentioned, or like, you know, someone who builds on the Salesforce marketplace or the AWS marketplace, and they're like, hey, this is my whole distribution strategy basically, is I'm just going to like attach myself to these types of companies, which there's a lot of very great massive companies that have been able to do that very successfully as well. And then what you often have is the other side of the coin, which is basically someone that's had the available budget to hire a partnerships person, and they've heard somewhere that it's a good idea, you know, and so they've basically gone out and found someone and hired them and said, hey, you figure this seems complicated, you figure it out for me. And like I would say 90+% of people that are in a partnerships role at a company that's less than say 200 people are in that situation where it's like they've kind of been chucked partnerships as a channel responsibility, but like at that point the CEO and the rest of the executive leadership team just couldn't care less. You know, it's like, okay, like that's one problem that's off my plate, like I'm going to get back to focusing on the business rather than thinking about, hey, like this is the business, like this is a really core part of the business. And I'm interested, I have my own hypotheses around this, but I'm interested in your perspective on like, why do you think that partnerships uniquely, because people don't do that with marketing, like they don't do it with sales, they don't do it with customer success, they don't do it with product and engineering, like you know, it seems like it's something that's fairly unique to the partnerships business. Why do you think it is that like partnership seems to be something that's like either like confusing or like just not mission critical enough to be prioritized at the executive level normally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so much of what you see at the surface level looks kind of like demonstrative, like, oh, the partnerships people host dinners and send like email re-engagement flows and manage, you know, payouts, or you know, send even like outbound for introductions. And so there's kind of a lot of it that, or like throw up logos on the website. You know, I think a lot of it just seems like, oh, this is just like a motion that we have to do to look legitimate, rather than, wow, this could be like an exponential like scaling opportunity for us. And I think it has to be, I think, you know, it helps that I have a background in product,
Yeah.
because like I think a lot of our partnerships in like in terms of our product as well, like how does this partnership influence the product, like how can the product be better because of it, and as a result of business as well. And you know, I like thinking, somebody recently was talking to me about partnerships and saying, you know, it's really interesting to think about, you know, how you can make your partner's business better too, which kind of makes it an even more fun challenge in that way. Like, oh, can we introduce like through our service another service that an agency could, you know, charge for ultimately? But that's just such a clear value than yeah, like us just, again, like throwing ourselves up on each other's websites and being like, yeah, we'll refer you sometimes, and then mostly forgetting. Like, um, I think, yeah, that I think a lot of times the connection with, yeah, the product and the actual like revenue impact is lost. And yeah, it's kind of thought of more at like a surface content marketing level. Not that content and marketing can go quite deep as well, obviously, and have a lot of value, but I think there is also just like a lack of understanding. And I think, you know, to your question on KPIs, like I bet a lot of the KPIs are set up poorly to begin with. Like it's maybe about number of partners, like, and what does it mean to be a partner? Like, yeah, maybe it's having a logo and a blog post, and or you know, number of dinners hosted, and like who the attendees are, but not actually looking at like, were those attendees high quality? Did they, you know, do they actually send leads? Do we send leads to them? Like, what is our relationship actually with them? Um, I mean, I think it's kind of like customers in a way. You know, it's just a different kind of sales in a way, because you ultimately, you know, if you're not solving real problems for each other, it's not going to end up being a good partnership.
Hmm.
And I think so much of what people invest in is more like the facade of partnership than the true partnership.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I love what you were saying about helping these agencies potentially build out their own like new service offerings. That's certainly like one of the desired end states for any partner manager is like, you work with a service provider and you want them to build a dedicated practice around your business, and you want it to generate a ton of revenue for them, and like you want them to grow and be successful, and the more that they grow and be successful, the more referrals you're going to receive, but also like the more value you're going to create for them, and it's this like amazing self-fulfilling loop. And like the ideal world is that you can kind of do something like that and find that kind of joint value proposition with all of your different partners, and then you just like you build like amazing companies together. And like
Right.
yeah, and it makes a ton of sense, especially in the kind of agency and service provider world. I'm like really interested because I've that is like a challenging conversation, I think, like with service providers, like getting them to their build on hours effectively,
Mhm.
right? So like any time spent learning a different product, or like trying to figure out a new service offering is like a little bit counterintuitive to them, right? Because it's like, unless it's like build hours on a client project, then and the client said, hey, you need to solve this problem, and your product is a solution to the problem, it's kind of like it starts to get away from their business model a little bit. And so I'm interested how you've kind of approached some of these conversations with the service providers in your ecosystem about them adopting your product, and where the value proposition is for them there.
Yeah, it's a good question, and something we're still kind of working out, I would say. I mean, again, like the strongest conversation is, as you said, like if the customer already wants to use our product and comes to them and says, "Figure it out," like they're going to figure it out, and then we're off on a pretty good footing because they've had to learn the software, and if they think that it delivers value and is easier to manage and ultimately is better for their customers and them, then we're in a good spot. For cold outreach, I mean, I think it's much more challenging, especially in a competitive market. But I think, yeah, it goes back to really thinking about them as the customer and what value it is that they're going to get. And the value, like you said, is definitely not spending time learning a new tool. And that is not what they want to hear. So yeah, it has to be, and ultimately, they do want their customers to succeed, and they do want to look good in terms of like picking out the right software. But even things that involve like, oh, your customers will have higher LTV or less churn is a little bit less interesting to them. It's harder to prove. So I think it comes down to what they value, which is kind of like ease and speed of implementation on their end, but to deliver like the same quality of work that they can bill for, um, being able to win more deals. So like we've been on sales calls with some of our partners where they'll even pitch clients different prices because of our tool, because they're able to achieve more with less time. So maybe they can win more customers with us, or like if we can uh, pitch them on offering more like retention services and things like that, and we can really deliver on that for them and make them look smart and more competent when it comes to retention. That's always an interesting strategy too. But yeah, I mean, I think it's all kind of an interesting experiment in yeah, how can we really solve their pain, which is different from solving the pain of our merchants. And so it's almost like bringing on like a new customer persona in a way. So we do think about it with our product development as well. Like how would a merchant use this? How would an agency use this? And so I think it warrants kind of that thorough like end to end thing, because you can't really like you can't really sell the same way to an agency as you would to a merchant. There's just different value that they're looking for.
Yeah, and it's awesome that you're kind of thinking about them as a key persona. Honestly, I think like partnerships people are going to be very excited to report to you, because like I think that is like again another like really desired end state for anyone kind of trying to up manage their executive leadership team is like, hey, like this is a massive user of our product. Like, one of the things that I ran into at Amplitude, incredible company, nothing but good things to say about them, but one of the things that I definitely experienced while working there was like that we were so dialed in to the use cases of our ideal customer profile that it was almost like sacrilegious to talk about the fact that like that half of our customers used agencies for building their products, and it was like, so a massive amount of our customers, like, Burger King's not building their own mobile app. Yeah, it's just like they don't have an in-house dev team and product team and all of that stuff. They outsource it to an agency, and like, the reality is that it's probably kind of a marketing team that's working on that app, and they're just like making high level decisions with their agency. But it was really difficult for the company to wrap their head around, like, yes, in an ideal world a customer would use our product like this, but for the vast majority of companies it's not just us and them, it's like us, them, a few other integrations that they want, like, they have like a road mapping product, they probably have like another analytics tool that they use, like a push notifications tool that they're going to use, like they have a handful of different agencies that are going to be working on this if they're a big enterprise company. Like, what tips would you have for people that are working in partnerships who spend all of their time with all of those other companies in the workflow, so they're like out, the like, if the rest of the company is just like company customer all the time, they're like the opposite, where they're just like out with all of the other companies all the time, and like the how can they approach bridging the gap between like their experience and then the experience of the rest of the company, pretty much, but in particular like the CEO and leadership team?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do think, the more I work on Atomic, the more I realize like how siloed I was in product away from like a lot of the true customer issues and like how people are actually using various products that I worked on. I think it's so important to always be connected with the people who are using your product. And, if a big percentage of them are agencies or, not, the your core persona, then that needs to be addressed. And I think, to some degree the numbers should speak for themselves, whether it's like in true percentage or like a fastest growing, growth channel. um and I would almost position it as like user research, at some level. It's like this is like an emerging new persona that we need to understand and define, and go watch them use the product, have videos, do like user testing around it, and listen to the types of problems that they have. um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think like it's something that the leadership team and the product team should all be all be looped into. And yeah, in terms of like how to get people's attention if they're not paying attention there, I mean, at the end of the day, leadership team should care about revenue. If there's revenue coming from partners and it's a big percentage, then I think starting with those numbers, like, hey, 80% of our business came from partners. Partners are these agencies. This is how they're using our product. That's really different from, this core persona and how they use our product. And kind of approaching it that way could be an interesting way to get people's attention. Like, I think people should be caring about where the money's coming from for the business, for sure.
Totally, because what I've found at least is like, especially on the product side, when the product team do take an interest, like you get amazing insights from agencies because they're absolute power users of your product, because they're generally like really technical. Also, they're like very happy to be transparent with you because they're not your customer, like they want you to just fix their problems, and they might be using your product across like 10, 20 different companies, and so it's like it's not just one siloed use case that you're getting. It's like, hey, I've used this for 4 different industries, like all these different size companies. Like here are the things that you can fix for me as like a true power user of the product. And so I have experience when product teams lean in and spend time with partners, they're so pleased that they do, because the level of insights that they get are amazing. And like hopefully companies are thinking about how they can get partners on their advisory boards and all of that kind of good stuff. And
Yeah.
so we've talked about agencies, and I would love to, like, I think that you're particularly dialed into this because, again, you spent some time deeply empathizing with service providers, I would imagine, when you were working on this like marketplace in the past. And I'm interested, like, how you feel like looking back on it now that maybe informed some of your like decision making around partnerships, or did you like go looking for these type of partners, or did you just run into them when you were kind of building Automatic, and you were just like a quick adopter of these strategies because of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think an interesting thread through my career is when I was building the marketplace, a lot of, on one side of the marketplace was like editors, kind of mostly like a single person service provider, single person business. At Eventbrite, also one side there is the event creators.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then now we work heavily with founders of brands, also many of them small business owners. And so I think through all of that, you have to think a lot about not only at the end of the day, like what it takes to build a successful business, but also the wide variety of needs and opinions and methodologies and outcomes and things like that. And it's interesting because our partners are also businesses, whether they're agencies or apps, and so I think um, having that kind of high level view of what do small business owners, I mean, all the way up to large business owners, care about and think about, and how are they organized and how do they make decisions. I think it all translates together, like whether they're your customers again or their agencies or partners. You kind of have to think about them the same way, and I think again it kind of all comes back to pain and value, and how you can help. And one common thread too that I think you asked a question before about, like, how do we kind of lean in and differentiate. I think
Mm-hmm.
the relationships are so important, like the even like support, their ability to trust and rely on you and really stake their business on you being a good business. I think so important, and that's true of businesses, whether they're businesses that are our customers or businesses that are our partners. And so I think there's some interesting commonalities that we carry through from my experience working with business owners for quite some time, like a large range and large variety of business owners. And yeah, I kind of think that a lot of that learning applies to our partners.
Yeah, that's awesome. Super interesting. And I think like those common threads throughout that you mentioned, especially around service providers, are just like it sets you up in a really great position for the types of folks you're working with now, and in an ecosystem that's just like packed full of agencies of all types that are working with these kind of major brands all the way down to like very small startups. So it's really cool to hear that. And I get, so we've talked about the kind of agencies and service providers. We've talked about kind of the kind of integrations, apps in the ecosystem. I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about Shopify, the £100 gorilla, or whatever. It's not £100, £1,000 gorilla. Yeah, £100 gorilla would be like quite a small one, I guess. Yeah, £1,000 gorilla. I don't know. We don't do pounds in the UK, right? So like this is confusing for me. But how are you thinking about navigating that ecosystem? Because if you think about like Salesforce has multiple companies that have gone public, and their only distribution channel is the Salesforce ecosystem. Like they whether they're a service provider, there's been a couple of those. There's Encino that went public like a couple of years ago now, and so there's and same thing with Amazon, same thing with Microsoft. These ecosystems, they provide huge distribution opportunities to reach into these customer bases if navigated correctly. But obviously, it's like a gigantic machine that you have to navigate. And so as like a kind of growing startup, how do you think about like developing a relationship with Shopify, and like how to kind of navigate that ecosystem, I guess?
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I mean, I think it's a similar world where there are businesses that have basically been either only or primarily Shopify apps that have gotten very large, and so I think it inherently comes with a lot of opportunity in that a brand selling on Shopify has to use an app to sell subscriptions. That's just the truth. Like, and so that's great for us because there will inevitably be a time where whether it's that they search in the app store or ask their agency or ask their friends or whatever it is, they're gonna ask the question like, how do I sell subscriptions, and want to solve that problem. So there's great benefit there. There's also a lot of opportunity for competition, which is interesting. And then, at the end of the day, it's kind of an unbalanced relationship. Shopify has a lot of power. And luckily, I think that, partnerships in the form of their apps are incredibly important to their business and something that, they've really been pretty public about in terms of wanting to support and believing, it makes them stronger. And so, you always want to see that when you're relying on a partner that heavily. And I think it's something that, is great to see they've leaned into. And, there's times where like I've heard they could be a better partner. And I think that that's probably always a challenge, as the business owner on the Shopify side, like when to do something and when not to, like when to do something in-house versus when not to. But one thing that I like is that even in times where I feel like they've, built something internally, they still leave the door open for partners to do
Hmm.
it differently or do it better. And I think that's really important. And I think ultimately, yeah, it makes them a better platform. It makes it so they can serve more use cases, different verticals, different like specific needs of various products. And I think having that mindset from the beginning makes it a great platform to build on. So yeah, it's interesting. I think as a distribution channel, it's great because we didn't have to think as much about like uh, paid advertising or a lot of the more traditional marketing tactics because there's an app store and you can search subscriptions and you can find our app, and that's a benefit that a lot of companies don't have. So yeah, I think that was an interesting part that made it easier to get off the ground. And so yeah, it all kind of ends up being more about like how do you see the bigger vision of the company, and balancing the fact that you can get quite large on Shopify, and the truth that there are other ways to grow outside of Shopify. And so it's nice because it all feels like opportunity rather than limitations. And yeah, I think it is nice in that there's such a strong foundation to build on. When I started my first company, I did a lot of the engineering work myself, and I was building things like login and really basic things just to get it going. Versus when you're building on top of like a really complex, sophisticated platform, you get to start with the harder, more interesting problems, and kind of start with a stronger opinion about what it is that you're doing that's different, versus kind of just the super basic functionality. So that's been an interesting part of it as well. But yeah, I think to your question on working with them, I do think because they're so large, it's always a balance, like getting their attention, getting their help. But I think ultimately, what it all comes down to is that we all have a common interest of helping our customers grow and making things easier for them. And what I've seen in the Shopify ecosystem is that the more you focus on that, just building something that your customers love and really need, you get rewarded in many ways, including partnerships and being surfaced more from Shopify. And so ultimately, I love that as a product person, like really just being able to focus on the problem that we're trying to solve and how to do it really, really well. And I think that's ultimately what Shopify will reward and surface too, whether it's like a person, like an account manager, or like their algorithms in terms of seeing, oh, there's lots of installs, people are not uninstalling, brands that use this app tend to see a lot of growth. Like I think they look at a lot of the data around app usage there, and that factors into how they surface companies too. So uh, we all have that shared common goal.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I hadn't really ever thought about it until you said that, but like the like one of the things that must be delightful about building in an ecosystem like theirs as like a builder is that you get to work on the fun stuff way faster because they've eliminated a lot of the like the kind of commodity boring stuff that people have to build, and I'd never really thought about that as like that's probably a great competitive differentiator for anyone that's trying to build a platform business. It's just like help developers get to working on fun things, like the things that are actually creating value as quick as possible. And I don't know, I haven't interacted with many folks that are building developer ecosystems that think about it like that actually, and I think that that's like quite a unique insight that I'll take away with me. So I appreciate you kind of sharing that. As super cool. Well, we've got time for one last question, and I'm excited to kind of, you mentioned before that you're kind of early in your journey around this, and it's something that you're kind of thinking about potentially resourcing more in the future. And I would love to hear, like, as you think about resourcing partnerships at your company, what is it like, what's the kind of roles that you're looking for, and like what are you looking for people to kind of show up and do when they start? Because I think a lot of people who listen to this probably are going into roles where maybe they're the first partnerships person, or maybe they're the first senior partnerships person where they're running a team or something, and there's an expectation level from the executive team that maybe they don't fully understand, and maybe the executive team aren't fully able to even communicate. And so I'd love to hear just from you, like if you're time traveling, and your new VP of partnerships or head of partnerships or whatever is starting, like what kind of what are you looking to them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think my thinking on this has evolved a lot lately. I think that, like you said, a lot of founders are not super aware of what they want and need here. So, I could imagine a lot of partnerships people coming in and just being handed, goals or KPIs that maybe won't actually lead to ultimately their role being that successful. And so, what I would love and what I think people should do is, start by talking to the company's existing most valuable partners, really understanding like why are these people good partners? Like, what does the business get out of the partnership? What do they get out of the partnership? How did it start? And then kind of doing more of a like, how can I, for the places where we already can be a really good partner, how do I find more partners like that? And then also identifying opportunities for like, maybe we could be a really good partner, but we're missing this piece. Is it part of the product? Is it, what needs to happen to develop that muscle, and kind of starting to advocate for that. And really thinking about it as like going deep rather than broad, on partnerships, and trying to understand, I think a big part of it is yeah, what is ultimately the goal of the partnership? And I think usually it's growth. And so it's about like, how can I become the answer that people give when anyone they talk to asks about the problem I'm trying to solve. And I think, they're kind of will emerge if some specific types of partners that are a much better fit than kind of like the broad spectrum. And so I think, in the first, however fast it's possible, like 30, 60, 90 days, like really trying to hone in on those personas, I guess, for partnerships and being as specific as possible, I think is really valuable. And then having some understanding of, if you can scale that, what does that end up looking like for the business? And then, yeah, really trying to get involved at a deeper level with the rest of the team, like the product team and the C-suite or whatever leadership, to try to influence some of the decisions around, yeah, thinking about partners as customers and the potential impact to growth. I think having that more kind of like business minded approach is ultimately going to be a much more successful, it's going to make people much more successful in the role. Ultimately, it's going to make the business more successful, which makes them successful in the role. It ultimately will prove that the channel is a really important area of investment, versus like I think a lot of people would have the feeling that they should jump in, do a bunch of outreach, host a bunch of events, kind of check off the list that a bunch of stuff happened. But it's going to be pretty quick, that people look at that and say, well, what did we get out of it? And if the answer is not much, then there's a problem. So I think rather than thinking of it as like, oh, I'm going to join a company and I'm going to do a lot more, how can I be super thoughtful and deliberate around finding, the biggest opportunities for impact with partners. I guess that would be really helpful. And I think, to your question of, me hiring somebody and what I would love to see from them is, yeah, coming in and really, telling me that's what's most important, and then jumping on defining those groups and opportunities. I think, really being self-driven is important, and it's something that ultimately, again, I think leads to more success in the role, because you won't get distracted by doing a bunch of kind of like busy work things that maybe even I would say, oh, this is important, and it turns out it's not. I think having a strong opinion coming in around like, how to identify the best partners and how to go about finding them is really important.
Yeah, I love that. I think the like if I was to take that and like distill it down, it sounds like it's definitely about focus and like focusing on what's important to the business, which is probably additive revenue, like growing revenue. And I think that that's probably where most people, partnerships people, slip up. To be honest, is like there's 1,000 ways that partners can help a business. Like we've talked about retention, and we've talked about extending product offerings, and we've talked about like all of these other things. But ultimately, pretty much everyone wants partners to drive additional revenue. So focusing on those partners, then focusing on that as like a driving metric, and then focusing on the right partners rather than just going super broad. Because I agree with you, like that ends up being a big distraction for the business when people are like, hey, like why are we even working with this company, or like is it this like why am I having to take a call with them or whatever, and like you end up missing a ton of things there. And then yeah, I really like how you kind of summed it up again with like focusing on impact, and like making sure that the efforts that you're doing with the right partners are actually driving impact, and that you're feeding that back to the business. Because yeah, it's really easy to go through the motions. I think the thing that's the easiest to get slipped up on as a partnerships person is like trying to manage all of the stakeholders internally, and you end up like with a meeting with the marketing team trying to get shared KPIs, and a meeting with the product team, and a meeting with and it's like you spend 80% of your time managing all of these internal stakeholders, and you've only got like 10-20% of your time left for partners, because like you're also trying to do one-on-ones with other people on the team and like whatever else, and so people end up doing their partnerships in the evenings and weekends because they're spending so much time trying to navigate an org internally. And so I really love that. I think that that's like very actionable feedback that everyone listening can kind of take back and use as a playbook. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
I love that word focus. I think that's so important. I think it's ultimately too with those internal stakeholder meetings. If you have a few really good partners, you're going to know which, hills you want to die on when you're fighting with the product team for something versus having like this massive spreadsheet of requests. I think focus with smaller, more impactful partners helps you focus in your internal stakeholder conversations and meetings, and then ultimately, like you said, you end up having a bigger impact.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, Emily, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know that people are going to love this episode. It's very, very actionable and, super interesting for me. I've had like a couple of light bulb moments having conversation with you today. So really, really appreciate it. And
Yeah.
we'll
Thank
get
you.
we'll get this out. And I think everyone will be really excited to hear it.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.